actually our last session at the Charbagh for the ZJLF Literature Festival this year. It's called Bloodlines. We have Kai Miller, Fraud Adigua, and Tishani Doshi in conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, our speakers.
Hi, can you hear? Oh yes, okay. Good evening everyone and welcome to the final day of the Jaipur Festival, which has been excellent, I think. I'm with two wonderful writers, poets, novelists, playwrights, short stories, essays. They teach very multifaceted people. Kai is from Jamaica and he currently lives and works in London. And Fred Degar is from Guyana, but currently lives in the United States and has also spent a lot of time in the UK. This panel is called Bloodlines, and it's a kind of strange and amorphous title. The idea is to talk about poetry and ancestry and family and how family can intrude into the writing in all kinds of ways. So I'm going to just get right into it, and I wanted to start with you, Fred. When you were 2 years old, you moved, you were taken to go and live in Guyana from, was it London? Your parents worked in the transport industry, I read, and I was very curious to know how that change affected your sense of identity, because after 10 years you then moved back to the UK. So if you could tell us a bit about that move and what it must have been like to go from a landscape like London to the place that your grandparents were in Guyana, and how that affected your sense of identity.
Thank you. All right, so at this level, you can hear me at the back there. Is this okay? Thank you. Tishani and Kai, pleasure to be with you guys here.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Not so much.
Not so much?
Take it or leave it.
That was pre-planned. No, I'm kidding. When I was born in London. My parents are from Guyana. When I came back to London, my memory of it is going to school the very first day, and I saw someone who looked like me, dark face. And I went up to him and said, "Hey, Brana, what go on?" Which is Guyanese for, "Hello, how's it hanging?" And he said to me, "You what, mate?" He had no idea what I was talking about. And I suddenly realized I wasn't in Kansas anymore, Dorothy. That I had actually changed landscapes, left my tongue behind, and come to a place where Cockney was a spoken tongue, and everybody there was speaking in that South London thing. So what I recognized was everybody where I'd come from who spoke like me, I'd left them behind. Of course, I very quickly found Brixton and other communities where those tongues were reasserted, but the first shock was I'd left a language community behind and come to a new place. And that forced me to think about where I was, what I was hearing, whether my tongue had to be forked. You know, in my last thought there, I saw an old film, The Lone Ranger, and whenever Tonto hears a lie, he always says, "White men speak with forked tongue," which is to imply that he's telling a lie, and if he were to tell the truth, there'd be a different kind of tongue would show itself. The forked tongue seemed to me to be actually a good quality, a necessary one to change registers. And if you go to a third landscape, you have to cut another little slice on your tongue, so it becomes three.
I wanted to ask you to speak actually about the fact that your sense of family is probably quite different from other people's, because you were raised in those early years not by your parents but by your grandparents.
Yes.
And another community. So what was that considered kind of a normal thing, or how did it affect your relationship with, say, your parents who would have been far away?
Yeah, they were far away, but I saw them often. So, and we always knew we would go back to London as soon as they could find their way and get organize something livable. The other thing about growing up in London was the kids were thought to be very slack, which means they always spoke back to their parents. And the Guyanese upbringing was seen to be a rigid place, a place where you got a foundation and you respected adults. You didn't answer back. You didn't look them in the eye for too long. Around the dinner table, you didn't talk unless spoken to. In England, kids are always running the conversations around dinner. And parents can never speak to other adults. They have to defer to the kid all the time. In the Caribbean, it's the other way around. In the UK, you have a room called the parlor. It's always messy and vandalized by kids. In the Caribbean, the parlor is the best room. Nobody goes in there unless invited. The kids tiptoe in that room and back out and bow. It's got the best china in a glass cabinet. That room is not possible to preserve that kind of a room in the UK unless you put booby traps around the door, because the kids feel they have right of way through the entire house. So there were some structural differences to Guyanese, being a Guyanese child, and then going with that childhood to the UK and being surrounded by a kind of much more permissive society.
Kai, you mentioned, and it could have been very late after a few glasses of wine, but I seem to remember you saying that you have a Norwegian ancestor and an Indian in your sort of heritage. Is that correct?
Yeah, which is just the Caribbean. It's just messed up. So there was a Norwegian sailor who traveled from Norway. He was a sailor, landed in Jamaica and never returned. Married an indentured Indian woman, and they had my grandmother. So my grandmother is a mix between those two. But I mean, obviously everyone else in the family is black. So yeah, I mean, the Caribbean is a very mixed up place. It's all these nations and nationalities coming together.
Yeah.
I mean, what's disturbing in that family line is that my father talks about my grandmother's brother, who comes out looking more white. He's blue-eyed, very fair hair, and my father, who's an extremely smart man, PhD'd, just wise and lovely. Referring to this family member, he always says, "Oh right, when Uncle Massa did so and so." And I said, "Dad, what?" He said, "Uncle Massa." So I said, Dad, you're black kids and you're referring to this man as Uncle Master." And Dad says, "But that was his name." And his nickname in that community was Master because he looked, physiologically, he looked, they said no one had any kind of political problem with this. And this just disturbs me greatly. And my father sees nothing wrong with this.
I wanted to ask about your beginnings as a kind of, the idea of being a writer. I know that one of your early jobs was you were a psychiatric nurse, and I want you to talk about that. But Kai, I don't know, what was sort of your trajectory from growing up in Jamaica and then heading to the UK, and at what point does writing enter your life? And also, you didn't start off as a poet. You wrote short stories, which I find extraordinary because I don't know of many writers who go to poetry after fiction.
Yeah.
It's always sort of poetry that then leads to other forms of writing.
Right.
So it's very extraordinary.
Yeah. There's one lie that I always tell that has to do with family. I mean, it's both a lie and it's the truth. I mean, the truth is one of my grandfathers was a writer and the other was a preacher. So my father's father was a journalist, and he always wanted to write his first book, never wrote it. And so his whole generation of friends were some of the early Caribbean writers. And my mother's father was a preacher. And I always feel that it's those two aesthetics that meet in me. Now, the truth is I never knew my mother's father or my father's father. So though these two strands are meeting in me, I don't think it's from that parental line. But clearly something is happening there. There are these two traditions happening in my family, and I have access to them. And so I think writing comes from that. Writing was always there. It was. I always want to say that. I started writing when I was 17 or when I was 19, and then I find some stupid book that I'd written. Like I found this novel that I wrote when I was 13 years old.
Oh wow!
Hidden under the bed. So I was writing for a long time. Never.
That's amazing.
But I liked Sidney Sheldon at the time. I wanted to write a Sidney Sheldon book. It was a holy grail of literature. Some spurned woman metes out revenge on an unsuspecting world.
Actually, I don't think it's so abnormal that you wrote a novel when you were 13. I forgot to mention in my introduction that between Kai and Fred, they've written a gazillion books. I mean, poetry, plays, novels, and essays. And you're both very prolific writers. I want to get to the subject of grandmothers. When I was at graduate school studying poetry, my poetry teacher, who will remain nameless, made a statement very early on, and that was no grandmother poems. He said no grandmother poems in my class, which I thought was very unfair. But it was also just that he found it to be sentimental or whatever.
Yeah.
And even though I was not close to either of my grandmothers, there is this idea of a grandmother that is beyond the personal, which is a kind of matriarchal a figure. And I know that you've both written about your grandmothers. So Fred, do you want to tell me about your grandmothers and maybe read a poem or two?
There's an academic movement, I must tell you, against sentimentality and against matriarchal figures that are presented as leading a household. It seemed to be problematic because the woman is trapped in a particular kind of role, larger than life and not real. My grandmother was exactly that. So when I wrote my poems, I did not care about it being sentimental because I was in love with my grandmother. I didn't care that they said, she's larger than life and not real because she was large. She was 6'3". She wore a long, dark dress, and she was big because I was that tall. And I looked up to her and thought, wow, when will she end? The other thing that happened with my grandmother is she never slept. People said to me, what do you mean she never slept? That's just Marquez, that's nonsense. I said, look, once upon a time, my cousins and I tried to stay awake long enough to see when our grandmother would go to sleep. And we all fell asleep, and when we woke up, she was watching us like this. And then the next time, we tried to wake up before her. We all went to bed, and as soon as we kind of got up really early. It was dark, and she was looking at us like this. So we thought, she never sleeps. She's as tall as a mountain. We couldn't see her legs because she wore a floor-length dress. We thought she didn't walk, she just floated. So we went up the stairs, we'd hide and say, try and see her legs. So we'd go under the stairs, and she'd say, get out from under there before I climb these stairs. We have to get out from under the stairs, then she'd climb the steps. So we thought she floated, she was tall as a hill, and she never slept. And so it goes on. Next thing, meals. She always fed us first, and then she wouldn't eat. And we thought, she's as tall as a hill, she flies, she never sleeps, she never eats. So we couldn't work out how she kept going, why she was so big and so powerful. And then I told this story yesterday. That one time I was with her at the seawall, where Guyana is 12 feet below sea level. And I was looking at the liners coming into port, and they were above us. And I'm sorry to repeat myself, those of you who heard this yesterday, you heard this yesterday. Anyway, the ships are coming in, and I said to her, Granny. We called her Granny. No, Mama Dot. Mama Dot. She's called Dorothy. You could never use our name Dorothy unless you were crazy. You'd be dead. So Mama Dot, why is it that the ships are coming in above us and then coming down to the port, and the water isn't coming in and drowning us all? And she looked at me. She had a handbag in this hand. She moved her handbag, which is dangerous. And she said to me, gravity. So anyway, there's more to that, but I'll stop.
Could you maybe read from Mama Dot? Maybe that's
Yes.
So that's Fred's first collection of poems called Mama Dot. So
Okay.
maybe read a poem.
I'm going to read a Creole poem because I am in Jaipur. I'll read it slowly. So it's English mashed up, as they say. Easter, we used to have kites made for us. And an adult would look at us, see how tall you were, and then send you away and make a kite from scratch. Pieces of wood, paste of paper on the wood, long tail, tongue. The kites here I've seen don't have the same kites like in Guyana. Very long tail on the kites, and with a tongue that sings when you float, you know those kites? Not here. They're much smaller and little square things. In Guyana they're real. They're as big as this, the kites. Now if a kite was made like that, and you're very tall, you can fly it. But the reason why the uncles would look at you before they made the kite is because if it's too big, and you got it in the air, it would drag you along. So they had to get your dimensions correctly. So this poem describes the process of a kite being made. Now, when the kites are made, Good Friday came along, and Good Friday, you couldn't do anything. You had to think about why we're alive, why the big sacrifice was made, and so forth, for the Christians among you. So we had to watch these kites that were tailor-made. We couldn't touch them. And people said, if you fly the kite on Good Friday, something terrible will happen. And one of my cousins said, you know what? I don't believe my grandmama is right. I think if I fly the kite, it'll be fine. He went out and we watched him. He flew the kite. Something terrible happened. This poem is all about that. Mamadot warns against an Easter rising. Don't raise no kite is Good Friday, but is out, he went out and fly it. Us thinking, maybe there won't be a breeze strong enough, and without any we to hold it for him, he'd never manage to get it high up to the treetop, where the wind kissing the ripest, sweetest fruit we can reach. But he let out some string bit by bit, tugging the face into the breeze, all the time taking a few steps back, and it did rise up bit by bit, till the long tail didn't touch the ground, and we gripped the paling fence we had squeezed between to watch him and trace its rise, up in the sky. We all want to fly in like bird, but can only kite fly. And he stepped back, just as we beginning to smile for him, envy him is Easter rising, when back he let out a scream, Lego kite, and the kite dropped out of the sky like a bird a sail down to the next field. And we run into him, forgetting the kite we uncled and met days ago, from wood shaved light as bird bone, paper thin like feather, and the tongue a kite for singing in the sky like a bird, and the tail for balance, string in the mouth like it pulling the longest worm. And we run to him, and we could see 7-inch of green heart wood gone in at the heel, running up him leg like a vein. He's screaming all the way to the hospital on the crossbar of a bicycle ridden by an uncle. She not saying a word, but we hearing her for the rest of that day and every year since. Don't raise no kite is Good Friday, and the sky was a birdless, kiteless wait for her word.
Thank you. Kai, what about your granny?
Well, I didn't grow with my granny, so, I have two grandmothers. One lives in my house now, which is annoying. My mother died about 6 years ago, and my grandmother, she lived for years in Canada. This is my father's mom. She came down for the funeral, and she said she'd just wait for the winter to be over before she went back up. We're still waiting. We only overheard her on the phone one day saying, someone had called her, she said, oh no, I'm living here now, which is in my bedroom. I think I'm going to have this strange distinction. My mother's mother died in my house, in my bedroom. She was visiting, she died out of spite. She had diarrhea, she said she was dying. We called in the doctors, they said, no, she's as strong as a horse. She said, no, I'm dying. And they said, no, there's nothing medically wrong with you. She died the next day. Out of sheer will, and she was ready. My mother fell ill some years after, and 6 years ago she died. I know my grandmother, my father's mother, at 94 years old, has moved back into the house. Oh. So I think I'm going to have three matriarchs. I can't count. 3 matriarchs who will probably all die at that house, all in my bedroom.
Oh, wow. And there is a poem about one of these matriarchs?
Yeah, so I'll read a poem about the first grandmother that died. And she had a strange story. Her first child is called, his birth certificate is a very strange thing. I always have to write it down. On his birth certificate, it holds the name Horace Nathaniel Joseph Jeremiah Ezekiel Samuel Moses Johnson. That's his full name. Mm-hmm. But what happened is that my grandmother had 6 miscarriages before the first child lived. Wow. And so when the first child lived, which was our 7th child, she invested every name that she could because she thought she wouldn't have any more kids. So all those names that were gone, she put in this one child, and so he carries all these names, which is kind of beautiful and kind of morbid at the same time. She went on to have 9 children, just by the way, but so she had to come up with new names after she had exhausted them all on this one child. But this poem is kind of about that. So this is the grandmother who was married to the pastor, and it talks about that noctiphobia for my grandmother. Because she was wife to the tall preacher man, Pentecost-tongued, whose every word whipped fire, whose oiled thumb pressed on women's foreheads, made them wheel and turn, then turn again like dogs under the spell of their own tails. And because she wore the gold ring he bought with Yankee dollars earned from digging through Panama, and they lay on a cot in a cool red house with bamboo doors never locked, a devil man stole in one night, woman's jealous money in his pocket, cemetery dirt in hands, which he rubbed onto her belly. Each time my grandmother swelled with child, an iron tide rose and drowned the baby. 6 times she felt a sudden stillness at midnight, learned how to vomit out the fetus, but my grandmother believed curse-breaking magic lived in the number 7. The familiar motion of a being inside sent her marching up to Riverhead to sprinkle her belly with water. The child was christened with 7 names, all meaning the lion who broke up the chains, and he is now a tall preacher man, Pentecost-tongued, whose every word was fire. The devil man is dead, choked on fishbone when he saw my grandmother approach, baby sucking from her tit. But I only remember her dying, shivering on a cot, singing, "Why should I fear the night, or the pestilence which walketh inside it?" All right.
I want to ask about family, because it seems to me that when you have a writer in the family, it's a very dangerous thing for everybody else in the family. And it's because writers, we take stories from everywhere, but especially the family, because it seems a very easy and obvious minefield about all these, So I'd like to talk to you both about sort of the reactions of your family when you began writing and began to be published. So when it ceased to be just scribbling, but actually, oh my God, the world is going to be reading stories of our family, and how did they react to that with you, Kai?
Not in a bad way, I think, but probably this is because I started as a fiction writer. And so even now when I write poems, even when they're very personal, there are these tools of fiction that I use to push it slightly away or push it slightly slant and disguise certain kinds of biographical truths. There's a book that I've wanted to write forever, which is probably the book I've always wanted to write. And it is about my grandmother. It's about a woman my grandfather was in love with. He had 4 children with her. And my grandmother raised these 4 children as her own, and they never ever told a soul. Growing up in my house, there was this when we went to one of my aunt's house, there was this she had lovely skin, an old black woman who sat in the corner, and no one ever said that was my grandfather's first lover. And she lived in the house as a kind of maid who had retired, and that's how they treated her. And there is a whole story there, and it is a dangerous story to write. And with every book, I think I am now going to write that story. And then I think, probably when my grandmother dies, or probably when my aunts get dementia a little bit. And so there are some risky stories that I actually have avoided.
Yeah. Fred, how about you? What was your reaction in your family when you began writing and you started to write about them?
With the Mama Dot poems, my first book of poems was called after my grandmother. And there are a number of poems that are biographical incidents. I mean, they're rooted in something that actually took place. So the kite flying poem, the cousin who actually got the piece of wood up in his foot has a scar. And when I went back, he pulled his trousers up and showed me the scar. "It's still here, boy." I said, "Yes, I'm sorry." And he was glad to be in the poem. But what I found about it, they were telling me over the years, the things I described about this place, my grandfather's house. He was from Madeira, and he had my grandmother of African descent. All the surroundings I described have now been changed, and the only way it can be confirmed is by looking at my poems. So my poems have become archaeological and oddly a weird document for the locality, for where we were, because the trees are gone, or there are new roads where there weren't roads before, or the water has receded much further away. People have moved away, more houses, for example. The rice fields have gone, which I describe in the book. So the book is now an archaeological object. It's an old thing. So I'm glad about that. There's a lot of pride as well about literacy in Guyana. Guyana went from having the highest literacy rate in the Caribbean to now struggling because of the IMF loans going wrong and so on. They're in a bad position. So literacy was always valued. Being able to publish was valued even more. So they're very proud, very proud.
Did either of you have this question of memory? You have siblings both, right? I know that when I wrote a novel and I drew from childhood, my sister refused to read it because she said, well, your memory is different from my memory, and if I read your memory, then it might overwrite my memory. And I'd never really thought about how we can appropriate memory, and that as a writer, in fact, we can change it. Like you were talking about fiction, it's not writing memoir or autobiography, but we take it from reality and put it into something. Have you had issues with appropriating memory?
Yeah, I mean, I probably sound like a bastard. I've just never struggled with this. I've always felt that what I want to tell in fiction or in poetry is the truth. And the truth and the facts are not the same thing. And I will use all the tools of fiction, all the tools of poetry to tell you the truth in the most direct way. And that means changing the facts. That means changing the story in ways that allow this point to come through faster. And it's a strange thing when I'm teaching creative writing now, and I say to a student, these two lines, you probably want to lose them, and they say, but that's what happened. And I go, but I don't care. I've just always felt that my life is in service to the poem and not to the facts that surround it. So I've always been very comfortable. But you're right. I mean, when me and my sister, we talk about growing up, and our memories are completely different. And I just accept that that's a part of life. I always say that, some people ask me what was life like growing up in Jamaica, which I think is an impossible question to answer for anywhere. It seems to me that every place has multiple versions of that place happening simultaneously. And it happens from family to family, but it happens from person to person. And so what I experienced growing up was not what my sister experienced. And
Right.
But that's the fun of it,
Yeah, there is a formality to recalling something. Which was it, Robert Lowell or one of those poets? Said that it's never something remembered, it's always something imagined. Even when you're working with memory, there's a formal device that it's transmuted. No matter how loyal you are to the memory and exact about the facts and the details, once you adorn it and rearrange it, it's transmuted into something different. So it's not really a recollection. And what he was trying to say was exactly this interference between art and the artifact and the thing you shape and the loyalty to the thing that occurred. At some point, you have to abandon loyalty if you're going to make the poem work. Yeah. Like you're saying about the 2 lines, I don't care about those 2 lines. Yeah. So I do think there is a sense of, and also because in writing the poem about the kite, I wrote that poem about the kite incident, and there were 20 cousins in the big house, children. All of them have different memories of the incident, but they've all over the years said to me, thank goodness you wrote that poem about the kite. And now the memory I had about the kite incident when it happened has been overtaken by time and by your poem. And my poem has now become the artifact, and the memories and their loyalties are fading, and all they have is the art object. So art will take a memory and a loyal incident and a factual event, and then do something to it that will enshrine it in some way. And I think that curating and archival process may be better than the thing that actually than the thing that actually happened, which sounds corrupt to say that, but you know what I mean?
No, and I think that point that Kai made is that at some point you do have to abandon this sense of loyalty. I mean, it was Faulkner who said, you know, if a writer needs to rob his mother, he'll do it because an ode to a Grecian urn is worth any number of old ladies.
No,
So
not from the Caribbean, you won't rob your
no,
mother.
no, no.
Not even for a point.
I want to talk about the idea of transformation, and maybe you can read also a poem. You both have written from the very personal, but you've also sort of extended out of that. Fred, you've written a remarkable book called Continental Shelf. You were teaching at Virginia Tech when the shootings happened in 2007. You lost a student, and you were there when it happened. I'm very curious about how we move from the personal, from the family, from what is our core into the universal, into what's outside. And particularly with poetry, how do we transform something that's very difficult into song? So if you could talk about that and maybe read a poem.
Okay. So for those of you who don't know about it, there was America where I work, a big problem is the possession of guns. And usually using guns to solve all your problems. So one of the difficulties is controlling how guns are acquired. And then the second thing is there's a frontier mentality in the States which still prevails, where your property is your property and any infringement could lead to a shootout or shooting at someone. There's just a mentality, it's a frontier mentality. And even though I meet very civilized Americans who have, you know, graduate degrees and so forth, they will still argue vehemently for gun rights and the right to purchase a gun and have a gun. Those of us who are pacifists and so forth, who would like to see no guns in the landscape and problems solved, you know, over drinking as many beers as possible, as quickly as possible, or whatever the work might be, but not violence, face an uphill struggle. There was a drumming session that people held. I lost a student from my Caribbean literature class who went to her French class and was killed. And when I met the students the next time I met them, we had to find a way to work with the grief. A number of things went on campus, and one of them was a drumming session. Tap drum, slap its body, beat out drum blood melody. Tum tum badap, bidi bit, tum tum badap. Wake drum, make drum talk and laugh like you're happy. Tum tum badap, bidi bit, tum tum badap. Goatskin drum, sheepskin drum, cowskin drum, obeah drum, medicine woman drum, African, Irish, Indian and Asian drum, soul, funk, rock, rap, pop, funk drum, tap, tap drum, tap, tam, badoom, bidi bit, bidi bim, tap, tap, badoom.
Kai, you wrote a light song of light. Well, you can read from that one if you want. But the reason I asked, because you spoke, I think it was an interview somewhere, and you talked about the utilitarian, like poetry having a utilitarian purpose, and you said that you wrote this book in response to your mother's death. And I am curious about, again, the same question of how do we take personal grief and make it into something manageable.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, okay. So I'll read this one, and Tishani is right that a light song of light was exactly about that. It was the economic crisis that hit England big time. So there was all of that going on, and in the midst of this, my mother died. 4 days after my mother died, Michael Jackson died. So I was in personal mourning. The world was in more general mourning. Uh, but I did wonder how, a very odd question. How, as a poet, how do you get yourself past that? How do you write a light song out of it? So the poems are all about getting to this place of singing again. But because my mother dies in the middle of the collection, a lot of it is singing a song for her. And somewhere in the middle of the collection, I thought, that's really easy to do. And sometimes that's very lazy to do. When someone dies, it's very easy to elegize them. That's what poets have always done. And I thought there was someone who was more deserving of an elegy and someone more deserving of a song sometimes. And we don't sing their songs while they're alive. And so this poem comes out of that. It's a very short poem, and it's called Unsung. Unsung. There should be a song for the man who does not sing himself, who has lifted a woman from her bed to a wheelchair each morning and from a wheelchair to her bed each night. A song for the man recognized by all the pharmacists because each day he has joined a line inched forward with a prescription for his ailing wife. There should be a song for this man who has not sung himself. He is father to an unmarried son and will one day witness the end of his name. Still, he has refused to pass down shame to his boy. There should be a song for the man whose life has not been the stuff of ballads, but who has lived each day in incredible and untrumpeted ways. There should be a song for my father.
I wanted to expand the idea of family and home and blood. I think there are two things that I want to talk about. I don't know how we have 20 minutes, okay. So quickly, this sense that language can be a home. There's a wonderful Indian poet called Jeet Thayil who's written a poem called English. And he, when we grow up here, there's always this pressure of why are you speaking this language and not that language, and why are you, and he came out with this beautiful poem saying that English has been my home, And I wanted to know whether there were either books that felt like home or that you have always returned to or that you carried with you, or in fact what your relationship is with language in a sense.
Well, Guyana has an oral tradition, which is very strong, storytelling, very common. I went from there to London, which everything is written down much more so, a recorded culture, much more scribal based, but both are invested in stories. At school, I had an English teacher who would read the Romantic poets, Wordsworth, Shelley, Coleridge, and so on, and would really dramatize their poems and made what sounded like an antique English sound very contemporary because he brought out the story in the poems, or the voice, or the argument. So he made me realize that poems had arguments running through them, through his reading of them and his dramatizing of them. And I suppose I fell in love with the sound. For language, it's the sound before the sense, for me growing up, because long before I understood a poem like Tintern Abbey by Wordsworth, I love the sound of that 5-page poem by Wordsworth, the way in which it trundles on in iambic pentameter. And then I fell in love with the descriptions of place and the nostalgia for a lost place, the ruins of Tintern Abbey, the location. So for me, the language was first and foremost a sound, and then the sense followed the sound.
Do you feel do you feel connected to this oral tradition? Do you feel a part of like a sense of continuity? Because I think sometimes it's oppressive to be, I have an Indian writer friend who does not like to be called a storyteller.
No,
in fact, he's a novelist.
Yeah, I think sometimes it is overstated. There's a kind of orality that I want to draw on, but I've always seen myself as a writer. I grew up in the suburbs of Kingston, and it wasn't even an incredibly violent place. I think I was telling some friends here the huge incident that happened on Forsyth Drive, which is the road that I grew up on, and it made all the old women on the road very nervous, was two teenagers walked by one day and threw an egg on Mrs. Hendricks' door. They were aghast. So it wasn't that Caribbean culture that's often almost made a myth out of it. It wasn't a fireside culture. No granny was telling me stories of a Nancy and giving me wisdom. It was a Caribbean steeped in modernity and, you know, brute concrete and all the trappings of middle classness. So, but you know, it was sufficiently a middle class house that there was a library. And I think if we think about what families are good for, I mean, it was a wonderfully nurturing family, but families all mess you up as well, right? I mean, all of our pathologies we get from our families. And if it's one thing that you should celebrate, or I celebrate my family for, which is a pretty, all in all, a good family, but where did I escape when they were too much? I escaped to literature. And thank God that they messed you up enough. And they had a library which you could escape to, that I thought, you know, I really don't want to see my mother right now. I really don't want to see my father. They are messed up individuals. And there were books that provided a retreat from the messed upness of their lives. And so, you know, so I don't only try to memorialize my family in literature, but I was running away from them because, like every family, they're not always sane, not always good, and not always, you know, they're weird people.
Yeah.
Generally.
We all can relate to that, I think. I'm going to open it up soon. I have one last question. Fred, I promised you that we'd talk about dance. And here we are going to talk about dance. I'm not quite sure how we can connect dance to ancestry, except that as a dancer myself, working with the body, and I think there's a sense of physicality and blood and skin and you know, which can transfer into writing. And you wrote a beautiful piece about dance, and your brother is a dancer. So can you talk about why dance is important to you and how that feeds into your writing?
Yeah, I can't dance. In London in the 70s, disco was big, and my brother went into ballet dancing. But whenever he came to a club with us, he went to Ballet Rambert in London, which was a very distinguished little. He would do his moves very slowly to his own time, and very quickly the dance floor would get very quiet, and they'd form a circle around him. So I knew the things I was doing, that was all, you know, that wasn't what he was doing. He was doing something much more artful, and then he was doing something that was very exciting to us. He seemed to be able to, in his moves, slow down time a little bit. He always had this way with his body, not to keep with the music, but always a little bit behind the beat, and always seemed to be in a register of time that was not quite what we were registering in our pulse, which I admire about dance. The idea of defying gravity and then moving, I mean, you know all about this, I shouldn't be telling you, but from watching him over the years dancing, I see that the slow time that he keeps and the way in which gravity is defied slightly are both privileges of the body, a trained body.
And Kai, is there a kind of equivalent in, because I think writers often turn to something physical that they do to help the writing process. Is there something that you...
You can talk about
Well,
it.
you have this poem about being chucked into the deep end by your mother. Yes. I think it has this idea, the idea
that's
that you were
all a
being
lie.
forced to, it's all a lie.
Yeah, no, that poem was a lie.
Oh, okay.
I mean, swimming more generally, I mean, not...
Swimming.
But only because when I'm writing, especially long things, I think the sheer monotony of going up and down a pool 50 times, when you're so tired that you're not thinking about it, you just kind of mechanically, you know, you go 50 meters, flip, next, and then you think, oh my God, that's what happens on the third page. And you come out of the pool because you finally worked it out, because you've given your body a way to relax and do something mindless. But I also do this by playing Candy Crush. I mean, whatever is mindless and has nothing to do with the work, and you just begin to do it mechanically, then your brain begins to process other things. And so I'd love to say it's swimming all the time, and it often is swimming, but Candy Crush works just as well.
Candy Crush. Okay,
for me.
disappointing. I was hoping there'd be time for a poem, but I think I would like to give the audience a chance to ask questions. If you have them, there might be somebody with a mic who can come around. There's a man right here in the third row. Oh, next.
Good afternoon. My question to Carl is how difficult it is to translate the memories into a poetic form.
How difficult is it is to?
Translate your memories into a poetic form and write a poem.
Yeah.
How true you can be, that's what I'm asking. How true you can be with your own self.
I don't know. Again, my commitment is strangely enough to the poem and not to the memory. I mean, I will try to be as faithful as possible, but you know there's this idea that, and I've read several poems like this, that there are these poems that recount an incident. I don't believe a poem can do that. A poem cannot recount an incident. A poem has to be the incident. A poem has to be the event. And when you experience the poem, what you want to feel is that I want to experience that poem again, even if there's an event that is being narrated at the heart of it. But there's so often you write a poem and all the poem is trying to do is to document this thing that happened and to exist there as a document. And I profoundly don't believe in that kind of poems, in that kind of poetry. And so for me it's always, what does this poem do differently than the event did? How am I committed to it in this poem? How is the language of this poem its own? And so that's my commitment in the end. Even if the incident is a part of what's in the middle of the poem. Does that make any sense? Yeah.
Do you have anything to say, Frank? There's a question here.
You mentioned talking about how bloodlines and ancestry influence your art, but you mentioned that your grandfather was type of a writer. So has that by any chance influenced why you write in any way?
No, only because I didn't have access to his writing until much later when I published my fourth book before I came across one of his articles. So I was already pretty much a writer. But certainly there is a culture of writing in the household. Again, it's just kind of what Fred said about in the Caribbean. There is this. I mean, without overgunning the whole oral tradition, there is this love of words and language and literature, and we all fall into that culture in different ways. I don't know what it was like for.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Any literary people in your
No.
family? I was reading a very interesting thing about, Naipaul and his father. And Koim Torbin, who was at this festival, wrote about how every time he published a novel, his mother would send him a very formal letter, but slightly disapproving. And then when he wrote about something that had happened to her, she said, maybe I'll write a book of my own. And this idea of the book as weapon, But that happens when you have literary people in the family. There's there and then in the front.
My question is to both of you, please. And this is just straight question, that is, how much do you think is the reality in the poems or the other literature that you write, whether it's prose or otherwise, and how much is it removed from the reality? Is it totally imaginary, or is it a mix of the two? And if it is a mix, what is the proportion like?
Proportional representation. Well, I think as Kai said, the poem is its own event. So it's not a record of an event. One. But in the poem may be some factual things that occurred. So the kite flying poem, there really was somebody, a cousin of mine, who flew a kite and disobeyed my grandmother and had an accident. And she had warned us not to do that. And that's the end of the loyalty to the event. The rest of it is something that's an enactment that is an emotional experience for the reader of the poem who has it for the first time. Therefore, the poem is the event, not another thing that happened somewhere that the poem is trying to measure up against. I can't give you a percentage. If I had to give you a percentage with the kite poem, I would say 5% of the kite poem, because there was a kite being made in there. I described the paper, the wood shaved light as bird bone, paper thin like feather. So I was trying to give you a sense of a constructed thing. And then I also said something that a lot of us thought about as kids. When we climb trees, we can only go so high, and then it's very dangerous to go any higher because you could break a limb and die. Birds, on the other hand, we always used to envy the birds who would get those bits of fruit you couldn't get down with a slingshot because there's something in the way or something. And so when I said the envy of a bird and having the kite take your place, all my cousins said yes. So there's a psychological truth that can't be quantified in a percentage terms, to do with the condition, the mental condition that the poem creates and reenacts. And that's about it though, but I wouldn't want to measure it against reality. Reality always wins.
Do you have anything you want to say something?
For me, it differs from poem to poem. The thing is, in my life, I've learned not to trust myself or my memory of things. Do you know this way in which you say, I mean, how we narrate ourselves in day-to-day life? I did this, or I went here, or I remember blah, blah, blah. There comes a point in my life where I always go, I've just learned something about myself. And by learning that, it recasts everything that I thought I was doing and why I was doing it in the past. Which is why therapy is great. So I realize even how I perceive myself moving through today and having experiences right now, even that isn't 100% accurate. That's only insofar as I understand myself. And so I will recount things in as far as I know and as far as I understand, but I don't trust that memory. When I say I know that I is an invention. It's me trying to come as close to possible as what my reality is, but it isn't 100% right. And so I think everything becomes flexible then, and I don't know what the percentage comes out to be. But I is this moving target that I would love to capture one day, but probably I did a PhD and I'm too much of a kind of deconstructionist, and I no longer believe in the self, and that's just a horrible thing.
Thank you for your talk. I was wondering to what extent did migration and in some cases multiple acts of migration shape your sensibilities as people and as writers, and not only linguistically? And given the migration, to what extent does the Caribbean remain central to your creative impulse?
Yeah, that's a great question. Wow. I mean, it's very central, and I've actually used a Caribbean sensibility to understand my American location, because America is such a large place with its time zones and ferment. I've tried to measure some things that I felt were the Caribbean got right against some of the things that America is getting wrong. So I've seen it as a formative time for my imagination, my sensibility. I also like the Caribbean's enjoyment of the body. In America, I do find that the sense of personal space, it may be to do with the landscape, is quite large and wide. Here in Jaipur, when someone came to talk to me, they would come really close and I'd try to move away, but there was nowhere to go. And the other thing they would do is grab hold of me like this. Sorry. And I think, why are they touching me and why are you so close? Because I realized I came from the US with this sense of privatized space that was really quite like that far away. And also, and so I quite like the fact that you guys are physically, that you brush against each other and you move. And I think, is he trying to tell me something? But the person wasn't trying to hurt me. They were just trying to say, get out of my way, or move faster. So what's happening here? I'm finding my American sense of personal space totally revised by Jaipur's sense of, no personal space. And also, just a sense of, you guys are kind of very bodacious, we call it in the Caribbean. You kind of, you front people a lot. You're kind of close, and it's a very Caribbean thing. So I feel like I'm back in Guyana when somebody comes up and they say to you, hey, I like what you said. They touch you first of all, and they hold you. They capture you. Then they said, I like what you said in the talk the other day, and so on. Then they get really close, and I don't lean back anymore. I try to lean forward. Forwards are touching. Because I understand that, it's a warm engagement and a joining up physically and a communication that's nonverbal as well, which I appreciate.
I hope I don't get in trouble to share this statistic. I mean, I genuinely read these two things in two separate magazines, and it was just too rich not to be amazed by it. But just on what you're saying, the country in the world that touches the least in physical interaction is the United Kingdom. So here, when you speak, you touch someone, and there's this hand-holding, and so they've measured people from different cultures and how often do they touch in a 10-minute conversation. And in England, basically zero. It's the most profound example of just not physically touching. Also, they measured the countries in the world that masturbate the most, and England comes out #1 as well. And I have to feel that the two things are connected.
Without touching?
Yeah, just the lack of personal touch and kind of intimacy just leads us to needing to touch ourselves, apparently. But your question was, how does migration, sorry, I'm sorry to take it to a very bad place. I think the most profound thing about migration is finally realizing, which people in India must have realized a long time ago traveling. For the first time I realized that the Caribbean wasn't only in the Caribbean, that the Caribbean wasn't geographically located in the Caribbean, and to go to Brixton and see the Caribbean performing itself again, and to go to New York and see the Caribbean performing itself energetically and creatively and in new ways, performing kinds of Caribbeanness that you don't encounter in the geographic Caribbean. That's a kind of amazing thing for me to wrap my mind around and just think about what are the different ways that we perform our identities in different landscapes. That does, I think, give a kind of broader scope to how I create the Caribbean in my work. So that was probably the most profound thing that happened for me.
I think I have time for one last question.
For
If
Fred.
anybody has one. Yes, here.
Is this on? Would you say that, and this is quite a broad question, but would you say that you write poetry like for yourselves, or would you say you kind of think about the reader more when you write?
Okay. I'm going to sound like a bastard again. I do not write poems for myself. If I cannot imagine a reader, I wouldn't write. Poetry, but probably again this comes out of writing fiction. Poetry was never therapeutic for me. And it doesn't mean that that I'm not trying to get to some truth, as again, not the facts, but to some deep truth that I'm trying to think through and work out. But writing is never for myself. Writing is, it's that would be like being a chef and cooking an amazing display of food and thinking, well, I've just cooked this 7-course meal, no one needs to eat it. Why? Why would you cook it then? I just don't see the point.
Yeah, the Virginia Tech poem. There are a few writers on campus, and we felt we had to do something with the art form. So that was one time when I felt I had to write for the fallen, just to say something about what we lost. So the art form was pressed into service, one of the few times in my life. Another time was when my grandmother died. I had to write a poem for her death. Another time, I just sat down and said, right, she's died, and I need to memorialize her. So I have occasionally used the art to, and it may come from my psychiatric nursing too, that I do feel when I think grief, and I'm stunned by grief, and I can write some words down, it's the art that makes me speechful again, because I've been made speechless by the event. Because I was stunned in Virginia for a long time when the shootings happened. Literally could not understand it and was in shock. And once I began to write, I began to recover something of myself through writing. So writing actually was helpful to me in a very personal, selfish way. And it served something. So I kind of vandalized my art by doing that, I know. But it was in a moment of grief and trauma, and it got me back on my feet.
Great. Well, thank you to